Okay, so at this point, this is empty. I don't have anything here. Probably move through a little bit faster because we've seen this stuff before. So let's bring in a bunch of modules that we're going to end up needing here. I'm going to do an npm init. And I'm going to install, let's see, we'll think about the client side things we need. We're going to need Angular. We'll need Bootstrap. And I'll say save. So we're also going to end up needing, again, things we sort of know we're going to have. We're going to end up needing Express. We're going to end up needing body parser. We're going to need Sequelize, and we'll end up grabbing in Postgres as well, just to make it a little bit more interesting. And we will save this as well. So let's start building this out a little bit. I'm just gonna put a couple of files here. We know that we're gonna need our server file. We're gonna need our app file. Again, the big rationale there between sort of separating those things out is more that's something that's gonna come up on testing than anything else, but our Express app is gonna be in the app folder. We're gonna start our server in the server folder, so we'll end up putting those two things in here. Let's just make a directory for our routes. And also, let's make a directory for our database, or at least our database objects. So if we wanted to sort of start out with this, again, if we're doing test-driven development, we could do this a little bit differently here. But a couple of things that we're going to need to do here is we know we're going to need to have an Express app. So let's go in here and we'll say Express equals require Express. And we'll create our app, and this will be Express. Again, if you were using ES6, you could call these constants. That's really what they are. And we're going to want to make sure that we end up exporting this. In terms of sort of having something that we're going to run to build this, let's actually just set up a few things here. So we're going to say, we're going to have this start dev task. And with this task, let's set up a couple of variables so we can deploy things pretty easily. We'll say database URL. And this is going to be equal to Postgres localhost. And this will be our items DB, which doesn't exist, but we'll end up creating it. We could do a port of 3000. And we're going to end up running nodemon. And just to sort of have this so we don't have to do it later on, we're going to ignore our files that are going to be inside of our browser folder, which is going to be all of our Angular. And we're just going to say server. Again, a lot of stuff. If you wanted to, you could build that out a little bit at a time here. We could actually go over here and say npm run start dev. And we'll immediately actually have no errors because, in fact, that file is there. Okay, it's not really doing anything. So what do we want to do when we end up starting this? So here's our app that we're going to end up exporting. And on our server file, we could go in here and we could say server equals require HTTP, create server, and we could end up requiring our app. Right, that'll probably, well, maybe not. I was going to say start breaking things, but of course, we do have the Express app, so that doesn't break anything. At this point, we could say server listen, and if we wanted to set this up, we could say port equals process environment port, or 3000, and we could listen on our port, and we could put a function here that specifies console.log listening on port plus port. And so that's fine. We've got this thing running. Well, let's actually break things quite a bit. Let's set up something where we'll say if process environment sync, meaning we want to basically, this is something that's a lot more important, I think, for a deployment. where we want to make sure our tables end up getting created when we deploy our application. So let's pretend this doesn't exist yet, but let's just pretend that we've got this require./db. And when we end up doing this, we're going to say db sync, then put a function, and we'll go up here and we'll say console.log synced. Otherwise, we'll do a catch, and we'll end up catching whatever errors that we have. I don't want to do this with a database. I showed you guys on a lot of your assignments, sort of setting things up in separate files, and we'll end up taking a look at that again. So right now this is going to break because it can't find DB, but if we go up here, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple different things here. So I'm going to set up a file called _db, and this is going to actually have my connection to my database. The way that I'm going to end up setting this up is to bring in sequelize, and I'll require it. And I'm going to create my database by saying new sequelize, and I'm going to use here my process environment database URL. Keep logging on for the moment, that's fine. One of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm going to attach this sequelize object. I'm just going to put a reference to it here, which is going to make my work a little bit easier because I'm not going to have to require it when I need it. And I'm going to export this. So I'm going to say module.exports equals db. Now, once I do that, I'm going to go back and I'm going to create an index file. And in my index file, I'll say db equals require./_db. Again, this is just a way of saying this is going to be my database connection that I'm going to be using. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say module.exports. And we're going to have some models that we're going to end up creating. But also we'll have this sync function here. And this is going to return sync db.sync force is true. And maybe we'll end up seeding it with some data as well. So this is not going to end up breaking anything, but if we actually go back to our package JSON file, and I'll go over here and I'll say sync equals true, and we go back here, and we're going to have to kill our process, because again, if you make a change to your package JSON, even though it looks like it's restarting, it's not restarting with the task that you want it to restart with. So here, if we wanted to use that variable, it'll tell us that it's synced, which is kind of interesting. I would expect that ended up giving us an error. But let's actually create some objects here. And so what we'll do here is that, again, I want to sort of separate things out. And the way that I'm going to separate them out, I'm going to say, hey, look, item require./item. And this is going to be my item model. So I'll say item is going to be item. And this will end up starting breaking things because I don't have item, but I could go in here and say item.js. And this is where this becomes pretty useful. db require./db. And now I can say item equals db define. This is going to be what the name of my table is. And this is going to be my configuration object. And I'm going to make sure that I want to export item. And let's just give this a name. So each item will have a name, the type, and here's where I use the sequelize. I could say db sequelize string, and also allow null to be false. And since I've exported that, now can't find db, and that is because it is going to be /. Okay, so here's actually where I find out. So in fact, sync will be fine if it doesn't have to create anything. But the second that you have models, if that database doesn't exist, you'll end up getting this error. So let's create that database. Let's go into pSQL, create database, items underscore DB. And if I kill this and restart it, now I'll have my model. And if I end up connecting to items DB and I look at it, I'll see that I've got this collection of items here. I've got this table for my items. Now, what I'm going to end up doing here is let's actually just make it a little bit more interesting so that in our index file, and again, if you had multiple items, that's fine too. Let's actually not just sync, but let's actually seed with a little bit of data too. So once we end up doing this, let's put a then here. And we'll say promise.all. And we'll create two items. Let's make sure we return from this. So we'll do item create. Name is foo. And it's a good name for another item. Bar is a great one, right? Foo 2. Let's do foo bar and baz. And that should end up running, and I could see that it ended up creating these for us. So now at this point, once we end up having these set up, let's go in and start setting up our routes, and then we'll go and we'll end up building our Angular out. But again, this could also be done, and if you were doing some test-driven development, it wouldn't be all that tough to do. Let's go in with our routes, and I'm going to create a items.js. So again, our routes are going to be plural. They're going to be RESTful routes. If we end up going back to our app, let's say app.use, and let's say API items is going to be require./routes items. This will end up throwing an exception because this is not actually going to be a router. So it says this is not, valid middleware. And let's go over and we can end up creating this middleware by saying router equals require express dot router, and we can end up exporting it router dot module dot exports equals router. So if we end up doing that, this should end up building. If we end up going to our browser and we open up localhost 3000, we don't have a get route. That's fine, but let's actually start testing out for an API items. And again, that doesn't exist either. So let's actually go and create that route. So this route is going to end up router.get / again, this is mounted as API.items. We've got a request, a response, and a next. And we're going to bring in our item. And here we could say require / DB. And we've got that models property. And we've got item. So this is our model. And we could say item find all. Then we've got our items. And again, our router is going to have to deal with a possibility of there being an error. So we'll do a catch with next. So if there's an error, next will end up getting called with that error, and we'll end up seeing the error. So at this point, we could say response.send items. And assuming we don't have any errors, we'll see the 3 items that we ended up adding. Now, we have those 3 items. Let's actually, one thing we could do here is we could actually open up Postman or some other tool. You can, even if you're comfortable using curl, you could do that. And let's go in, and I'm going to paste this route in. So this is going to be a get of localhost 3000 API items. And that'll show me my 3 items. But let's say that we actually want to do a post. And if we look at our body for our post, we could specify that we are going to send this data. And I think I already have a content type of JSON. But we're going to go and assume that we can send some other object, and if we do that and that's a post, we're going to expect that this is going to work. Obviously, it's not going to work now because we don't have that route, but if we were to go back here, we could end up doing our post route, and this is going to be request, response, next. And so when we go to create this, we'll say item, and we're going to destroy. Where are we going to destroy? Well, we need to have a where clause here. So we'll say where ID request params. I don't know why I'm doing destroy. I apologize. Create. And when we create, the second time I did that, we're going to do name, and we'll do request.body.name. And if we're able to create, we'll do a then write RESTful route. We'll get our item back, and we'll send that item back. And we'll also go here and we'll do a catch of next. So now we actually have that post route. Let's go back here, try to run it. And if we go over here, we'll get an error because it says it can't rename of undefined, and that's because we don't have body parser there. So body parser is going to be set up in our app file. And we could go over here and we could say app.use require body parser, and we're going to parse this as JSON data so that when stuff comes over the wire, we're parsing it as JSON data. And when we do that, we should see that we could end up adding an item. Just for the sake of argument, let's actually see that we could remove items so that if we end up doing a delete to 1, we should be able to delete, which obviously we can't now. But let's go in there and set that up. And this is a pretty easy thing to set up. We're here, we're going to do a router.delete. We'll say ID. That's what we're passing there to identify the resource. And here's where we'll end up using our destroy. Item.destroy. And here's where we're going to have our where. And this is going to be ID, request, params, ID. And if we're successful at that, we're going to do a then. And we'll here just say response.send status 200. Right? You could look up the status codes. There's different status codes for destroy, but for now this is fine. And we'll do a catch of next. So if we do that, we could find out that we could delete an item. If I go back and I end up looking at my localhost 3000 API items, right, I should see that I only have 2 of them because one of them got deleted. Every time I restart, it's going to recreate them. Okay, once we end up having these server-side routes, we could start focusing a little bit more on Angular and setting that up. So here, we've got, under our node modules, we've got Angular, and we've also got Bootstrap. So let's set up under our app. We'll make this pretty simple where we'll make a get request, response, next. And we'll say response.send file, and we'll use our path.join. And we'll say, because it needs an absolute path, and we'll say we're going to join that in index.html. So this is just going to be a file that we're going to send back, and this is really going to have all of our logic on this file. And let's actually go in and create that file.
You need to require that.
Yes, thank you. Testing you out there, Jeff. Path equals require path. And this should still end up building here, and let's create our index.html. So in our index.html, let's put in some HTML tags. And let's put in our head tag. And we'll put in our body tag. And we'll just put in something class, well, and we'll put in items app. Not terribly exciting. Let's go in here and bring a couple of things in here. So we'll do a link. This is going to be a style sheet. And this is going to be an href. And this is going to be bootstrap. Right? This is dist. CSS, I think. Bootstrap, we'll find out soon enough. And we're also going to want to bring in Angular. So we'll say script source equals, and I think this is just slash Angular, AngularJS. So once we end up putting those things in here, so this is not going to quite work. If we go over here and we try to load this, it'll say items app, but we could see that there's a couple of different files that it's not going to be able to load. It's not loading Angular. It's not loading Bootstrap. So let's go in and set up a static route for these guys. So up here, we'll say app.use, express.static, and we're going to say directory name, node modules, close that, and actually path.join, missed one. And we're also going to need this for our browser as well. So just sort of thinking ahead a little bit, let's set this up. And let's just see if we ended up getting our Bootstrap and Angular, which it looks like we did. So let's start modifying. Again, I like to sort of just make sure that Angular, my sanity check by doing something like that. And Angular is not set up. The only thing I need to do if I want to set up Angular is just say ng-app. Okay, so now we know that Angular is set up. So we're going to bring a couple of different things here. What I'm looking to do here is that also to sort of nail down what we ended up doing with directives. So what I'm hoping to do is something like this. Status, closing status, and underneath this, list, closing list, keep this thing pretty generic. And status is going to tell me how many items that I have. And list is going to be a directive to show me those items. And to keep it simple, we'll just end up dealing with delete. Okay? Obviously, this is not going to do anything here. It's not going to break, but it's not going to do anything. These tags will be here, but Angular is ignoring them. And in fact, Angular is, even though it's strapped up here, we haven't set up our app. So what we'll do here is we'll say ng-app equals app. Of course, that'll end up blowing things up because Angular says, I don't see a module called app. And let's start setting this up. And we're going to look at a build task that's going to help us out a little bit. So let's go over here, and let's add our browser directory. And let's add app.js. And in app.js, we'll say Angular module app, like this. Now we know the one thing that we need to do is we need to bring this app file into our application. Again, right now, even though we created that file is not being included. Well, let's actually look at a build task that we could use that'll basically put all of, we'll say, hey, look, here's a folder. And this folder has JavaScript files. I want you to inject this in our index.html to make our lives a little bit easier. So if we end up looking up, this is a fairly common one to use. I mean, we've seen the number of times you've seen where you end up creating a JavaScript file and things are not working, and you realize it's because you didn't put the script tag in here. So if we look at this Gulp inject task, there's a lot of different settings that you could use here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to want to use this. And the way that this is going to end up working is that you can inject not just style sheets, but you could also inject, not just JavaScript, but style sheets as well. So here's an example. Keep on getting these calls, which I'm trying to ignore. So what I'm going to do here is let's set up Gulp. We haven't really used Gulp at all, but let's set it up. I'm just turning off my phone. Okay. So what we're going to do here is let's do a npm install, and we're going to install Gulp, and we'll install Gulp inject. Now again, these are things that you're not going to need for your application to run, but you need them for your development environment. So I'm going to bring in these two files. We haven't really used Gulp at all, but it's something that's going to end up getting used in some of the projects that we look at. So once you end up installing Gulp, what it'll end up doing is that if I just type in the word Gulp, it'll tell me no Gulp file found. Okay? If I end up touching gulpfile.js, and now I type Gulp, it'll give me a different message, and it'll say, you have Gulp, but you have no default task. Well, setting up your Gulp file is fairly easy. We have got our file here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say Gulp require Gulp, because Gulp is installed for us locally. And then I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to specify Gulp task default function, and if I just do console.log, hello, I could do that, and if I run Gulp, I'll see that hello will end up printing out. Now, what are we going to end up doing with Gulp? I'm going to install Gulp. Did I install Gulp inject already? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have Gulp inject. So I'm going to bring this in here and say require Gulp inject. And for my task, I'm going to create a task called inject. And I'm just going to make sure that this is going to be working by saying console.log inject. And now if I go over here and I say Gulp, so it's basically just Gulp and the name of the task, inject, it'll just print out inject. Now I don't want to print out inject. What I want to do is I want to take all my files. So the way that this is going to work is that I could specify the source files that I want. And what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to specify a target. So my target is going to be my index file. Mine's just going to be under the root. And that's going to be what my target is. And I'm going to say my target is I'm going to be piping. And I'm going to inject. The files that it's going to look for are going to be under my browser file. And they're going to be all of my JavaScript files. And I'm going to specify that I'm going to pipe it right back to my index file. So it's basically going to modify my index file. So I'm going to copy this stuff here and modify it. This is not going to be my index task. And let's get rid of this stuff here and let's simplify this a little bit. So this is going to be inject. My source is going to be my index file, which is here. And I'm going to inject my sources. What do my sources look like? My sources are going to be gulp.source. And here I could put a pattern here. If I just went like this and I said star.js, that's valid as my source. And so what it's going to do here is it's going to go and look for files that are in this directory, and that's actually not the right directory. Mine's going to be in browser, right? So inside of browser, I've got JavaScript files, and I'm going to put a destination right back here. So basically, it's going to read the index file, it's going to find the JavaScript files, and it's going to inject them here. Now, if I run this, it's not going to throw an error, but going to say nothing to inject. And let's figure out why there's nothing to inject. Surely, I've got some files down here, But the one thing that I don't have is a placeholder to specify where I want these to be injected. So the way to do this is that I'm just copying what's in here. The way that this works is that I could go in here, and if I just put in these two tags, now it's got a landing spot of those files to go and inject. So I could go back over here, and if I actually go back and look at my index file, I'll see that my app file ended up getting injected. Now, there's one problem that I do have here, and that is that I set up my static route so that if I end up going back and I load this page, and let's actually just make sure my server is running, npm run start start dev. If I go back and run that, I'll notice that it's not going to find these files, and it's not going to find them because when you create a static route, basically it's looking in the browser folder. Now, I can modify things. I can modify the way inject works, but there's a very easy fix for this. If I go back to my app file, I'm going to change my static route for my browser, and I'm going to basically, we talk about mounting middleware. I'm going to mount this, and I'm going to say, hey, look, if anything comes in with /browser, look inside this folder, okay? So what that'll do is that instead of leaving off the browser part of anything, I should see that it's going to end up finding those files, and you saw that my errors ended up going away. So the nice thing about that is that just to sort of show you how that works, if I was to go over here and add under my browser foo.js, and inside of foo, do alert, hello. Now again, if I reload this page, I'm not going to see that. But if I go back over here and I say gulp inject, I'll end up seeing that because that file will have ended up getting added over here, right? So you can see that that ends up getting added. Now let me just do one other thing here because I don't want to have to keep on running this task all the time. So there's something else that I could do just to make my life a little bit easier. This is also pretty common. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a task, and I'm going to call it watch inject. And what this is going to do is that I'm going to say gulp.watch, and I'm basically, what am I going to watch? I'm going to watch /browser star.js, and when that ends up running, I'm going to specify that I want to call the task inject. So in other words, if there's any changes to my folder, it'll rerun that task. And so now if I was to go over here and say gulp watch inject, this is going to be running in the background. And now if I was to go over here to my browser and delete foo, I would see that if I went back to my index file, foo would not quite be gone, so that was not exactly what I was looking for. Although, yeah, it did. It was gone. I just didn't see it. So we can see that that's gone. One minor modification I want to make here is that with this gulp file, we want to make sure that our app file ends up loading first. So we could set this up as an array. And if we wanted to, like, sometimes we have a configuration file that we want to load first. And here, what I'm just going to basically say is that, hey, look, the first thing that I want you to install is inside browser app.js. And I'm going to go over here. I'm going to kill this. And I'll just show you one more little thing. One of the things that you can do if you have a task you could specify any list of tasks that you want to have run before. So this is kind of a cool feature. I'm going to say, when I call watch, run inject, and if there are any changes, I want you to run inject again. So now if I just go back here and say gulp, and we're just going to let this sit in the background, watch, inject. This is going to be running, and it's just going to make our life a little bit easier. In fact, I'm going to end up closing off, because I don't want to see that message again. My index file, and let's actually work and do a couple of other things here. So once I have my app set up,
why did you need 2 stars in browser/star stars?
Because if I have any if I have JavaScript files that are below that level, I want them to end up getting included as well. Okay, we'll find out if this is working. John.
When you add app.js separately, do you have to worry about it being injected twice? Or
No, it won't get injected twice. So that what'll happen is that it'll see all the files that it has to inject, and it'll only inject the ones it wants. And this allows you to basically set up the order for this. This is a fairly, I mean, if you look at this, again, this is the first time that you're getting exposed to this, so I wouldn't, expect you to be able to write it from scratch. I could barely write it from scratch. In fact, I couldn't write it from scratch. You saw me go in and copy and paste. But this is a pretty fairly common thing that you'll do. Again, you might not be totally aware of the syntax, but you can see it's not a lot of code to get this running, and it's a big plus for your development. Now, what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to go in and start adding some directives. So I'm actually I'll create a folder called Directives, just to show you that it'll add this file that's below, and I'm going to create a status.js, just to see that this is working. And I'll say Angular module app. I'm going to grab the module. I'm not crazy about doing global variables. And I'll go over here and I'll say directive. And this is going to be my status directive. The only thing that this has to return is a configuration object. And let's say that this is we're going to restrict this so that this is just going to be an element directive. And let's just, to see that it's working, let's just say we have a template. So now if we end up doing that, we go back here. Let's just see if it ended up bringing this in. So our directive is status. Here's our app. I think our inject should be running here. You shouldn't have to. Let's see, that was a little bit strange. So that tells us I'm the status directive. And let's actually modify this so that, I think this thing possibly is just delayed, although I'm not positive. Worst case scenario, we'll have to, my watch is not working properly and I'll have to run that, but it's better than going in and copying and pasting this stuff in all the time. You see it actually put it in the correct order. So let's go over here and we will, in our browser and in this directive, instead of putting in a template, let's do a template URL. And this is going to be inside of our browser folder. Let's do browser/template status.html. Once we end up doing that, right, we'll start getting error messages that it can't find that status file. And let's go over here and templates status.html, and let's just go over here and say div class equals well div status. So if we ended up going back to our index.html file and put in 4 of these, we'd get 4 of these to show up, right? We don't need 4 of them. But just for the sake of argument, let's put 1 on the top, we'll put 1 on the bottom. And let's go in and start building this out. So on our status, let's go over here and we'll set up a controller. We're going to grab our scope. Okay, again, I'm not using the link function. I don't think the link function really buys me all that much. But I'm going to have a service. It's going to be my item service, but I'm just going to call it service. I call this status. I'll call this service. If I went to run this, it'll tell me that it doesn't know what service is. So let's go back here. We could create a folder. I'm just going to call this service.js. Angular module, service, function, and at least no, I think it something is a little bit strange here. Let's actually just take a look at this. Yeah, but still, I'm just also concerned that it's not showing up here. You're probably right. So here, yes, Angular module. That's incorrect, right? It's Angular module app, but that's not what I'm too worried about here. And here we'll do factory, and this is going to be our service. And the only thing we need to do is return an object. And let's just kill this. And I'm just going to say gulp inject. I'll try to figure out why that watch is not working. So once I end up doing that, that error will end up going away. But let's say that this service is going to have, let's sort of build this out a little bit. Service is going to have this find all method. And initially, we'll do this without the source of truth. We'll do it incorrectly. Let's go in here, and we're going to bring in our HTTP. And we'll go over here, and we'll say return. And this is going to be $HTTP. This is going to be a get/API items. We know that that route works because we tested it out. We're going to do a then function. Right? When we use HTTP, this gives us a result. And for now, we're going to return result.items. And for our status control, what we'll do is we'll go back to our directive for our status, and we'll say service find all, then function, and we'll say scope dot items equals items, which we'll get back here. Again, we want our controllers to be kind of dumb, although our controllers are going to be responsible for showing an error if there is an error. We don't want these to just die on the vine, so we'll say console.log error. So now if we end up doing that, and if we end up going back to our templates, let's go in here and we'll say there are items.length items. And doesn't know what items are. Let's just troubleshoot this a little bit.
There is something called.
I'm not sure about that. Maybe. Let's see. Could be right. I think our service is already there, so I don't think I need to do that again. Yeah, so it's not gulp. Let's just take a look, and let's just do on directives for our status. Scope.items is items. Let's just do a console.log, see if we get some items.
You did result.items. Was that right?
Yeah, you know, maybe you're right. Let's see. It's going to be result.data.
Yeah.
This guy is, you know, I screwed you guys up again on purpose. Right? This is going to be our data. And now if we do that, right, it tells us that there's 3 items. Now, let's do another directive. So we're going to do another directive, and this is going to be a directive for our list. And we'll go over here and we'll say app.module list, Angular. It's not going to be list.html. It's going to be list.js. And here we'll say Angular module list. Same thing again. App, directive, list. The other thing that we probably want to do here, and this I sort of neglected to do, let's actually just do it now. You're going to want to have your directives to have isolated scope, right? I mean, you're going to want these things to be encapsulated. So let's just make sure that we give it an isolated scope. We're not passing anything into it at the moment. This should still work the same way. Let's go back to our list. And we're going to return, and we'll do sort of similar thing here. Our scope is going to be isolated. Our template URL is going to be /browser templates list.html. And we'll set up our controller. Again, scope, and we'll put in this one service that we have. And so that's what we're going to end up returning, and we'll say service, find all, then function. And over here, we will specify that we're going to use our items, same as we did in the other one. Scope.items equals items. And let's, again, just make sure that we end up catching an error if there is one. So if we end up running that, I think I've got an extra semicolon here. Service find all. Let's just take a look. No, that's my controller. That's my return. And this should be the end. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. And let me go in here and just type gulp inject. And if I go back here and I run this, it'll tell me that it can't find that template. Let's go and create that template. So this is going to be list.html. That'll make this error go away. And what we'll do in this list.html is we'll do an unordered list, class, list, group, item, unordered list. And this will be our list item. We'll say ng repeat item in items. And so this looks a little bit decent. We'll give it a class of list, group, item. And this will be item.name. And at this point, we should see that we have our 3 items here. So let's go and investigate, do something simple to delete an item. We'll say ng click, destroy, and we'll pass in this item. We know we have a route for this, but in our directive itself, let's go over here on our list, and on our controller here, we're going to say scope.destroy, and we're going to end up passing in an item. And when we end up doing that, we'll tell our service to destroy the item. Let's put a catch here. Console.log error. Again, we're going to assume that our service is going to handle our work for us. We're not going to be doing much here. If we were to run this now, I'd get an error that destroy doesn't exist. But I could go back and I could find my file for my service and put in a destroy. Destroy is going to be a pretty similar route to this. In fact, I'll go over here. And this is going to be delete. Again, you don't need method override for an AJAX request. This is going to end up getting sent in an item plus item.id. I'm not going to be doing anything with this data that I end up getting back for the moment. So right now, we'll just end up doing this. Now, what's going to happen here, when I run this, this will actually delete. I don't see any errors here, but I have to refresh the page to see that it's deleted. So there's a couple of things that I want to be able to do here. One of the things that I could do to get this to work, or at least get this to work from my list view, is something like I could delete, and I could do it then. And after I go and do my delete, I'm going to have a little problem of my that and this here. So I'm going to do with that equals this. And when I get in here, I'm going to say return that find all. This is not my preferred way to do it. But now if I ended up going back here, you're right on the money, man. No, so once I end up doing that, okay, let me go back. Again, I want my directive, my controller here to be kind of dumb. And so I'll go back to my list. And I'll say that when I go to destroy, I'm going to get back my items. And I could go over here and I could say scope.items equals items, right? Because that's what I'm passing back from my service. And if that works, what I should be able to do is delete this and see that it goes away. But of course, notice it's still telling me that I've got 2 items here, right? Let me rerun my app so I get some more items back here. Notice my app doesn't rerun because I did ignore that anything in my browser file won't cause a refresh. So let me get 3 more items back here. Now, again, the problem that I run into is that I don't have this one source of truth, okay? What I've got is that my items are being modified here, but that has no impact on these items that are on this controller. And what can easily solve my problem here is to make sure that when I call find all, I always return the same object. So if I end up going back to my service, instead of actually returning my data directly, which is going to be a new array every time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create items as an array. And I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to specify Angular copy result.data into items. And I'm going to end up returning items. So this way, whenever anyone calls find all, okay, even though it might change, whenever anyone ends up calling find all, they'll end up getting the same data back. And what this should give me the ability to do is now, if I end up making a modification to here, it ends up updating here. Right, on the same token, just so we have it inside of our list, just so we can test it out. If I go back to my list.html, let's just put in a div. Let's actually put in a form. Let's give it a name of form. And we'll give this div class form group, so we'll have a little bit of spacing here. And we'll put an input, and we'll do ng model, and this is going to be item.name. We'll make it required. And let's give this a class of form control. And we'll put a button here, class equals btn primary, save, button. And when we go over here, we'll do ng click, and we'll just call create. So this should give us, Let's also just do one other thing. This is looking pretty nasty here. Let's just go over to our index.html file. Let's put all this stuff in a container, so it's not bleeding off to the sides. In which case, we could go and indent this. Okay, so we've got our save button here. Let's actually do something I had mentioned to you folks on the homework, which is that if we go to this browser, let's go to our templates, and let's just specify ng disabled. When do we want it disabled? We want it disabled when the form is invalid. And it's going to be invalid when there's no name. ng disabled, not disable. So now it's disabled. Now it's not disabled.
Is that? Oh, never mind.
Right, and again, the reason why we have that is we set this up with a form. That gives us a form directive. Again, that gives us also the ability to do things like, I'm not going to do it now, but we could do things, with our individual text boxes as well, which I think I've showed you before. So what I want to do here is that if I go back to my list, let's do scope.create function. We're not passing anything in here, but we're going to tell our service to create scope.item. And again, I'm not worried about a success. I'm just worried about a failure. Console.log error. Again, if we go to run this, we'll run into a problem because there is no create method in our service. But again, as long as in our service, here's our find all, here's our destroy, and literally, we could pretty much copy our destroy, call this create, and this is going to be a post. It's not going to have an ID yet, but when we post it, we're going to send back our item. And again, instead of actually, if you notice what I'm doing here, instead of sort of monkeying around with my internal collection, when this gets called, I'm going to make sure that my source of truth is updated by calling find all. Okay? Again, anyone that's working with items is always working within the same collection of items. And now if I go to run this, I could go in here and put in fizz, buzz, and I could see that this ends up updating. And just as a measure in my controller itself, and again, I'm saying controller, it's a directive, but my directive has a controller associated with it. I'm going to actually use this then. So if I am successful, I'm going to say scope.item is equal to null. And so here, if I put some stuff in, I'll see that will end up getting added. So again, another example of this idea with the source of truth. And by the way, there literally is no clean way to do this without having that source of truth. Okay? To have these status directives and have them get updated, okay? They don't know when to get updated. Sure, I could do something, some kind of broadcast message to my app and say, all right, something was added, go refresh your items, okay? But I don't have to do that because they're always looking at these items.
And the source of truth idea only works if it's an object, right? Because if it was
It's got to be an object, right? It can't be like a number, right? Now, one other thing that I just want to point out, because people had asked about this, on my status template, I'm just going to put in because someone asked about, how often the digest cycle ends up running. So I'm going to put this in. I'm going to have some method called fizz on my list. And nothing's going to happen here, but what I want to point out here is that, again, this is on my list, so I'm going to go back over here. And again, Angular is kind of nice about that. It says, hey, look, this method doesn't exist. I'm not going to give you an error. But when I call fizz, just to sort of show you this, I'm going to go and return. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to say console log math.random. And I'm also going to return the string fizz. What I want you to see here, look at how many times that gets called. Okay? Meaning that when you put a method, okay, that's going to end up getting called, what I'm getting at here is that's going to get called every time the digest cycle ends up getting called. You don't control when the digest cycle gets called. Okay? But the digest cycle is getting called a number of times here. The reason why it's getting called a number of times is that every time there's a $HTTP, the digest cycle is called. And it gets called for other reasons too. And the way that the digest cycle works is that the digest cycle will end up getting called, okay? And it'll see that is everything on the scope stabilized, okay? Because sometimes you can have something on the scope that impacts something else, okay? So it'll run through again. If it gets the exact same values twice, it's done, okay? That's why you end up seeing it get called multiple times here. That's where you have to sort of be aware if you end up doing the digest cycle with find all or something like that. You just want to be careful about that. All right? So again, the point is that you're not in control of the digest cycle. You have to leave Angular in control of the digest cycle. The only time you have to worry about the digest cycle is if you're doing something outside of Angular's control. Like we ended up doing in the workshop where we had some event listener that we added to the audio object. That's when you have to worry about it. All right, so I know we definitely went the time limit. I think that hopefully that was kind of helpful. We'll figure out why the Gulp watch task is not working, and we'll dig into Gulp a little bit more as we go, a little bit at a time. There's a lot of Gulp that you're going to see when we end up looking at Stack Store, and it's good to have a little bit of familiarity before we start. Again, it falls under the category of build tools. What else might you use those for? Well, something like this. Also, if you were decided that you were going to for instance, maybe write code in ES6, and you wanted to make sure that it ended up getting compiled to something that could work on all browsers. You would run some kind of task that would end up compiling that. What else would you might do the Gulp task? Style sheets. If you had SAS and you wanted to compile it, you could do that with the Gulp task as well. You could even start your server with the Gulp task as well. Maybe we'll look at that again as well. Come up with some better examples for that. All right, I think that's going to do it. I will save this repo up, and I'll also save this video up.
What's the advantage of having a link versus a controller?